On the night of April 4th, 1943, the desert sky above Libya was choked in the worst sandstorm the airmen had ever seen. The formation of lumbering B-24 Liberators of the 9th Air Force's 376 Bomb Group climbed into the storm-darkened sky from Soluch Airfield, bound for Naples. Another bombing run. But the lashing sand soon took their toll. Engines groaned as they took in more and more sand. Planes began peeling off, limping back to base with engines clogged and pilots blind behind their windscreens. But the crew of Lady Be Good pressed on, her 4 engines growling through the tortured air. 30 minutes from their target, pilot William J. Hatton realized the sand had ground its way into the engines. Power was fading, the aircraft was experiencing mechanical malfunctions, and the darkness was absolute. He decided to pull back to base. Yet, amid the darkness and confusion, they were lost. Desperate for a bearing, navigator D.P. Hayes radioed Soluch, saying his automatic direction finder was not working. The course was plotted almost blindly. With faulty navigation equipment, the men prayed for the best. But Lady Be Good wasn't flying over the Mediterranean as the crew believed. She was flying hundreds of miles deep into the endless Libyan desert, and fuel was running out. Despite the brutal sandstorm and the chaos of wartime raids, every B-24 Liberator made it back to Soluch Airfield near Benghazi, Libya. Every plane except one, Lady Be Good. At first, no one panicked. Lady Be Good had been one of the last bombers to take off, so it made sense that she'd be one of the last to return. But minutes turned into hours, and officers grew uneasy. The crew's last radio message had been troubling. Attempts to contact pilot William J. Hatton or any of the crew went unanswered. A search and rescue operation was launched immediately. American aircraft combed the Mediterranean, scouring the waves for wreckage or signs of a water landing. But there was nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no flares. The rescuers would never find Lady Be Good, because she wasn't in the sea. She was over 400 miles inland, deep in the Sahara Desert, where Hatton and his crew were locked in a desperate fight for survival. The inexperienced crew had flown far past the coastline without realizing it. By the time the airmen understood their mistake, it was too late. Radio silence answered every distress call. Out of options, Hatton made the call to descend, hoping to spot something, anything, that would tell them where they were. But when the reality set in, it was grim. Fuel was nearly gone, and they had no idea how far they were from the base. Hatton climbed again, changing direction in a final attempt to find lights, signs of a city, an airfield, life. Minutes passed. Tension rose. Then, the final decision was made. They would have to bail out. Days passed. Silence. The search was eventually called off, and Lady Be Good was marked as another wartime loss. It would take over 15 years for the truth of what happened to the crew of Lady Be Good to finally come to light. In November 1958, British geologists working for the Darcy Oil Company spotted a crashed plane while flying over the Libyan desert. They marked the location and reported it to Wheelus Air Force Base. However, Wheelus had no record of an American plane lost in that area and dismissed the report. Months later, after repeated sightings and no response from the U.S. military, Darcy Oil decided to act. In March 1959, they sent a ground team to investigate. The wreckage was located on a barren gravel plain near the edge of the sand sea of Calancio, 440 miles south of Soluch, Libya. The Lady Be Good had skidded nearly 700 yards during its crash landing. The fuselage had broken behind the wings, but the aircraft remained largely intact. 3 of the 4 engines had been feathered, indicating they weren't under power during impact. Remarkably, the plane was in excellent condition. A .50 caliber machine gun was still functional, firing perfectly when a recovery team member pulled the trigger. A malfunctioning radio from a C-47 cargo plane was even replaced with one salvaged from Lady Be Good. It worked flawlessly. The rear escape hatch and bomb bay doors were open. No parachutes or life preservers were found on board, suggesting the crew had bailed out before the crash. Gordon Bowerman, the surveyor leading the Darcy team, was a friend of Lieutenant Colonel Walter B. Colbus, commander of Wheelus Air Base. After inspecting the site, Bowerman wrote a letter to Colbus detailing findings. including maintenance records and crew names found on clothing and equipment. This letter finally spurred action. In May 1959, the U.S. military launched an official investigation. Teams conducted extensive ground and air searches across the desert. The search turned up parachutes, flight boots, and arrowhead markers laid out by the crew, signs they had attempted to guide rescuers to their position. The deployed parachutes were used as trail markers, pointing in the direction they had traveled. But despite months of effort, no crew remains were found. In time, the official search was called off. The report concluded, quote, "The search was abandoned when equipment began to deteriorate and fail, and the probability of the airmen being completely covered by shifting sand made further search impractical." 16 years after Lady Be Good vanished, her wreckage had been found. But the 9 airmen remained lost to the desert, their fate still a mystery. The next breakthrough in the mystery of Lady Be Good came, once again, thanks to British petroleum workers. In the vastness of the Libyan desert, while searching for oil, they stumbled upon human remains on a desolate plateau within the sand sea. Word reached the Army Quartermaster mortuary, and officials returned to Libya. The remains were identified as Lieutenant William J. Hatton, Lieutenant Robert F. Toner, Lieutenant D.P. Hayes, Sergeant Harold J. Adams, and Sergeant Robert E. Lamott. Canteens, flashlights, scraps of parachutes, and worn flight jackets were scattered around them. But the most haunting discovery was a small weathered diary. It belonged to Lieutenant Robert Toner. The diary held 8 days of tense, desperate entries spanning April 5th to April 12th, 1943. It told the story of survival and inevitable collapse. The crew had done everything in their power to signal for help as they spread across the desert. But help never came. The mortuary could not leave it there. They had to find the rest of the crew. A final, desperate mission was launched, Operation Climax. A joint Army-Air Force search team was assembled. 19 men, 6 vehicles, 2 helicopters, and a 4-member Army Public Information Group to document every moment. High-altitude reconnaissance jets crisscrossed the skies, their cameras scanning the endless expanse below. A C-130 cargo plane airdropped equipment and supplies into the desert. On the ground, the search party battled heat, sandstorms, and exhaustion. Then, on May 12, 1960, British petroleum workers made another discovery: the remains of Staff Sergeant Guy E. Shelley, found 21 miles northwest of the first site. 5 days later, on May 17th, one of the helicopters spotted Technical Sergeant Harold J. Ripslinger lying lifeless on the eastern slope of a massive dune 26 miles further north. The terrain was a nightmare, endless shifting dunes towering 600 feet high, swallowing trails and evidence with every gust of wind. Operation Climax dragged on for weeks, but it was called off by late May. 2 men were still unaccounted for. Then, in August 1960, British petroleum workers stumbled onto another grim discovery. Lieutenant John S. Warovka was found lying in the sand, still in his full high-altitude flight suit, his parachute still strapped to him. It had failed to deploy properly, and he perished instantly upon impact. Near the site, scattered parachute harnesses and pieces of flight clothing marked the place where the crew had bailed out into the cold desert night. But Staff Sergeant Vernon L. Moore was never found. His story was cut short, somewhere in the sand. With all the evidence at hand and the contents of the diary they found, military officials were finally able to piece together the dramatic final moments of Lady Be Good and her crew. The picture that emerged was one of confusion, desperation, and unimaginable endurance. After aborting their bombing run over Naples on April 4th, 1943, Lady Be Good turned back toward Libya. But the fierce sandstorm that had plagued their outward journey had not relented. Visibility was nearly zero, instruments were unreliable, and the vast expanse of the desert below blended seamlessly into the night sky. With their automatic direction finder malfunctioning, the crew relied on dead reckoning and radio guidance from Soluch Airfield. Somewhere in that chaotic exchange, a catastrophic error occurred. The crew believed they were flying over the Mediterranean Sea, heading toward home. In reality, they were miles inland, deep over the Libyan desert. The terrain below offered no clues, just endless, featureless sand. Fuel began to run dangerously low. The crew faced an impossible decision as the engine sputtered to a stop one by one. They could not see the ground, and landing an aircraft blind in the desert at night was near impossible. Instead, Captain William Hatton ordered the crew to bail out. The men bailed out at 2 o'clock in the morning on April 5th. 9 men jumped into the freezing desert night. 8 parachutes opened successfully. Lieutenant John Worovka's did not. The remaining 8 men regrouped on the ground, approximately 15 miles from where Lady Be Good would later crash. In the silent, moonlit desert, the vastness of their mistake became clear. They were not over water, nor were they anywhere near a rescue point. They expected to be much closer to Soluch Airfield than they actually were. They decided to leave a trail of markers in the sand, certain an Allied warplane was bound to fly overhead any moment now. With only half a canteen of water between them, the men walked north, hoping to find civilization, or at least a landmark. They covered 85 agonizing miles in blistering heat by day and freezing cold by night. Temperatures reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit at midday, and the dry desert air offered no relief. Exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke began to take their toll. At some point, Lieutenants Hatton, Toner, Hayes, and Sergeants Adams and Lamott could go no further. They lay down together in the sand, too weak to move, hoping rescue would come. Sergeant Shelley, Moore, and Ripslinger pressed on, their bodies weakened and their minds clouded by thirst and fatigue. One by one, they too succumbed to the desert's relentless grip. Back at the crash site, Lady Be Good sat eerily preserved by the dry desert air. 16 years later, when discovered by British oil workers, the aircraft appeared almost untouched. The fuselage was broken behind the wings from the impact, but everything was remarkably intact inside. There were supplies, food rations, drinkable water, flares, and even a functional radio. The bitterest irony of all, if the crew had chosen to stay with the plane after bailing out, their chances of survival would have been exponentially higher. They could have used the supplies, communicated via radio, and signaled rescuers. But in the pitch-black night, with no reference points and no knowledge of where the plane had landed, the men were left with only their instincts, and those instincts led them north towards what they hoped was safety. The story of Lady Be Good and her crew does not end in the sands of Libya. The plane's wreckage was eventually recovered, and pieces of it were sent to various museums and memorials worldwide. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, now displays a stained glass window dedicated to the crew, a quiet, beautiful tribute to 9 men who vanished into the desert night and fought with every ounce of strength they had to make it home. Books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and even paintings have kept their memory alive. Their sacrifice is not forgotten.